Ladies and gentlemen, it is my esteemed pleasure to welcome Gareth from See the Pattern to discuss a very pertinent paper that's coming out in multiple levels. So there's multiple lines of scientific discovery on these auroral observations that happened over 2,000 years ago, some of them. The earliest observations are around 600 plus BC, and these have been corroborated. So first the data was found in ice cores, and then other scientific papers came out corroborating the data from Assyrian tablets. And then Gareth went out and found an even earlier paper from 2004 where they actually have cuneiform tablets that describe similar events. And the cuneiform tablets actually describe the event to the exact day. And we'll get to that. It's a pleasure to have you on, Gareth, to talk about this. How have you been?
I'm doing really well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have to say, it's not something that I normally do, looking at the history. It is something I want to get into more and more. But, I've kind of focused on trying to follow the understanding of some of those concepts. So it was a really interesting sort of diversion to do. And I have to say a big thank you to one of my patrons, Chris, who was able to dig out some of those other papers. And it's fascinating because even if you look at the first paper, the Assyrian paper, which is the one that has been sort of published recently, that dates to 660 BC, I think it is. And it is not as specific. So it doesn't use the words aurora because maybe they didn't have the word for it, or maybe we don't understand what the translation is. But they talk about red glowing fog in the sky that remained for long periods of time. So they obviously made a connection with obviously the ice core data that we talked about, but with it also being some sort of an aurora event. Now the problem is, if you look at where Assyria is, it is incredibly far south, and you would normally never expect to find the aurora that far south. So that's one of the big questions when you look at this. Well, how on earth could that happen? And then I found the other paper, which was from, I think it's 100 years later, which is the Babylonian text. And the detail in that paper is quite astonishing because it is, as you say, literally down to not quite the minute and second, but it's like someone's record keeping and just noting down all these events, but very, very similar. Again, they talk about the same colors in the sky, reds and sort of purples and pinks, which again is not normally what we would see when we look at auroras, because normally when you see pictures of auroras, it tends to be green. So red is, if you look at the colors in the aurora, so normally green, yellow, and sort of browny colors are caused by oxygen, and the blues and the reds and the purples are caused by nitrogen, which is an interesting.
You froze up a little bit there. You were just on nitrogen, Gareth.
You get particles slamming into it, which causes it to get excited, and it then gives off the color of light. And each atom has its own color signature. But what is interesting is the question comes back to how can you have the auroras happen that far south? So one of the first things that I started to think about is, well, that obviously in order to get the aurora, you have to have particles streaming out from the sun. And normally we would only see the auroras very far up north. But when you have particularly large solar storms, what can happen is that you have extra particles which are streaming out, which can cause the aurora to come further south. And when you have very extreme events, and you have something like a coronal mass ejection, what happens then is there's effectively like a whole lump of plasma ejected from the surface of the sun, which moves towards Earth, and it sort of squashes the size of the magnetic field down, and it will cause more particles to enter into the top end and cause that aurora to happen much further down south. So the first example that we know that is extremely well documented about this is the Carrington event, which happened in 1859. And it was first observed by an astronomer called Carrington, and he observed the flashes on the sun, which is like a precursor to it happening, so solar flares. And then I think it was 3 or so days later, the solar storm actually hit. So this plasma moved out from the sun and then hit the Earth. And in those days, they had huge telegraph poles which would carry the lines. And obviously, they were nowhere near as sophisticated as we are today. And what happened is a lot of those lines actually caught on fire. They sparked all over them, and a lot of the telegraph operators were electrocuted. They didn't die, but they got electric shocks from the machines. And, they were able to see auroras much further south as well. And that event, that Carrington event, was, relatively speaking, quite a small event compared to what potentially might have happened in the past. And again, when I was doing research for this, I kind of ventured onto Robert Schoch's idea, which documents a huge solar event which occurred about 10,000 years BC. So he puts this idea that this massive activity on the sun may have triggered the end of the last ice age. So again, in that perspective, what we're seeing is much smaller than that. So it's an interesting comparison. And again, the problem is even the Carrington event, considering it's a relatively small compared to what could happen, if that happened today, it would be large parts of our systems would just get wiped out. We rely so much on electronics, which has very small amounts of wires and are very sensitive to static electricity, that the majority of your power grids, your internet will just simply get wiped out. So it's something that actually most governments actually have a contingency plan to work for that, because obviously, how do you deal with that if because I think it happened recently in Canada, wasn't it? A large portion of the power grid went out due to a solar storm, and it was extremely difficult for them to get it back up. So that's one of the things that they do have to look at.
That was back in '89. But let's talk real quick about the Carrington event and the aurora. That aurora was visible as far south as Cuba for several days, and they could even read by newspaper from the glow. So even a small event brings aurora almost down towards the equator, so to speak. And let's also tie it in with the Robert Schoch work. I believe Robert Schoch was at the point where he thought that the actual rongo, which is a tablet of vocabulary, so to speak, of petroglyphs that come from the people on Easter Island, he believed that the rongo was actually plasmoids or plasma discharge, just like Parat instabilities. And the reason I wanted you on the show today was to speculate a little bit about what these ancient cultures would have seen as far as the Easter Island people and that extinction event. Well, they saw what was on the rongo. And it's my contention that these events that we're talking about, like the 568 BC event, may have been witnessed by native Puebloans in North America. Now, it might be that these native Puebloans' petroglyphs are actually mimicking the rongo and is actually ancient information that has been passed down since 10,500 BC. Do you think that that's a possibility?
I think certainly the passing down of information is without doubt a possibility, because I think if an event like Robert sort of talks about did occur, the lasting consequences on the impact it would make on humanity and the few that would survive such an event would be stories that would be told forever and ever. And I think even if so let's say that in the 660 BC that it was due to a big solar storm, even if that didn't necessarily produce all of the same effects, so maybe there wasn't a squatter man visible in the sky, but they might have seen, because of that extra activity, they might have seen sprites, or they might have seen aurora with particular shapes. Would that have triggered certain things that they had heard that had been passed on through generations that made them then think, oh my God, it's happening again. And therefore they felt the need to start documenting it. I don't know. I mean, that would be my speculation on it. I don't think that those smaller events are necessarily capable of producing, because in order to get that Parat instability, you need a lot of energy. And I don't think that those smaller level events could necessarily produce that sort of thing. But the way the human mind works is you can often see patterns in things that when you look at them, whether it's clouds or other things. So therefore, could they recognize similar shapes in the aurora, which changes all the time, that made them then think that this was going to happen again?
Okay, so if we have enough energy from one of these events, solar energetic particles are high energy particles coming from the sun, ranging from a few tens of keV to many GeV. So there's a huge range. Let's say we have a solar flare 10 times the Carrington event with the coronal mass ejection. What are the ancients going to see? It's just not going to be a regular aurora. Are they going to see Squatterman and these single pole ladders dancing on the horizon, or will there just be a singular one in the North Pole?
That depends on what, because I think part of, and I haven't gone into an awful lot of detail of Robert's work, but part of it is to do with that amount of energy effectively starts to ionize the atmosphere. So the whole Earth becomes a bit like a plasma ball in that respect. So there's an awful lot of energy in, which is why it's so devastating for life on Earth. For me, in that scenario, it's more likely that you would get multiple copies of those events. But I'm no expert in plasma, especially when you're looking at it on a globe size. So if it's the whole globe that's lighting up because that amount of energy is basically ionizing a large fraction of our atmosphere, I would think you would start to see these sorts of things scattered across the sky. It wouldn't be a singular event, because a singular event to me has to happen outside. You're seeing it outside of the atmosphere, and therefore it's visible to certain parts of the sky, depending on whether it's day or night, as you rotate around. So that's more likely to happen if you have an interaction between a planet and another planet coming close together. So there's a massive exchange of plasma and discharging between those, would be my gut feel. So if an event like that is able to produce and ionize the air, I suspect you will see repeated smaller patterns of those things. And whether it's the ladders or whether it is a Squatterman figure, I guess it depends on the amount of energy that's released and how it's released from the top downwards.
Yeah, because we were just at an area the other day, and almost all of every single plasma instability that Parat has published, we saw etched on the rocks exactly as he had made them in a laboratory, which was fascinating because it then got me thinking about the polar configuration and the fact that Mars and Venus were at war. And at some point, if that were the case, when they ripped apart, we would also have these electrical events. And according to Velikovsky, isn't this time frame around 660 BC when Venus is supposed to be flying around?
I'm no expert on Velikovsky, and he also had the compressed timeline as well. So I don't know how that fits in with this. So I don't know, to be honest.
What do you mean by the compressed timeline?
Well, didn't he view that the timeline of history was different to what was essentially written down in terms of the span of the number of years between certain events that occurred? And maybe I'm mixing two things up here. I don't know. I've read a lot of stuff recently.
Well, that's a good thing. That means we're getting somewhere.
Well, the problem is, for everything you read, there are more questions that you ask. But that is, I guess, part of the journey. The exciting thing is knowing for everything you learn, there are many more questions waiting for you. And that's the beauty of it, I think.
Yeah. Now, clearly we can separate the mass extinction event, the one that buried the Moai on Easter Island, and the one where man actually buried Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, as being a very significant event and coming nowhere close to the ones that are discussed in these papers. And I really like how you brought to the table the fact that maybe it's our psyche that was able to reinterpret what was happening at this time and remember what happened in the past. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, for me, I think there's a lot. I mean, it depends on what you believe. But the more that I read and the more that I kind of look into it, the more that I believe that our understanding of how humanity has evolved is wrong. And the idea that, the further back we look, that the more stupid man becomes is wrong. So I very much believe in this idea of cycles of time. And therefore, the fact that at some point we devolve and then we become more evolved and then we devolve. So it keeps going in a cycle that goes up and down. So therefore, if we look far enough back, that actually what we would see is humanity maybe being more intelligent than we are now, maybe having more advanced equipment. The problem is so little of that is left behind because civilizations get destroyed, and particularly if an event like shock kind of puts forward happened, most of humanity would be wiped out. And we're talking, the time frame for these cycles is 12,000 years from going from a low to a high. So it's an extremely long period of time. And if I was them and you had a good enough understanding of the fact that there were these cycles which tended to repeat themselves, maybe not exactly like clockwork, but enough that you could predict that the sun is going to go into a more active period or the sun's going to go into a lower active period for whatever reason, that you would try and pass that information on. You would encode that information in a way that transcends language and transcends time, but will allow the people in the future to be able to look at these and gain some sort of understanding. And I think the problem is nowadays when we look at ancient pictures and ancient writings, we see them as just that, pictures and artwork that were the expressions of their inner feelings. But the fact is, well, it's not a fact, but my belief is that some of those are actually recording really important events and information that are trying to be passed on from generation to generation in a way that doesn't require language. So you would use symbols, you would use some sort of, a dance or song or something that expresses emotions or feelings without having to use words. And the same thing as well, I believe, is if we look at the constellations and the concept of the constellations and some of the stories that sit behind those, there is information in that that is stored there, I believe, to be passed on for future generations when we are ready or willing to actually listen and hear those messages. So for me, when they see these patterns in the skies, it sort of triggers the fact that they have been drawing these sorts of shapes because that's, what the stories that are passed on. As soon as you then start to recognize some of these shapes in the sky, you'd start to go, oh, yeah, this is real. This is becoming real for me. So, I very much believe that.
Well, you just said a minute ago that the periodicity of the major events is 12,000 years. How do you feel living on that flexure point currently?
Yeah. It depends on whose time scale you go by, and it depends on where you put those. And for that, there is a lot of discrepancy between the different models. If you go with the shock model, then yeah, we are very much, that's 10,000 years ago. So we have another 2,000 years potentially to go. But I don't know whether those timescales necessarily dictate those sorts of events. If you look at the Kali Yuga, then that's a 24,000 year cycle from its highest point to its lowest point as a repeated cycle. It goes up and then it goes down and then it goes back up and then it goes down. But does that necessarily mean that those events are always the same events? For me, it's not 12,000 years. The events are spaced at 24,000 years-ish. But it could well be that halfway through that cycle, there is if it's like a circular path, then you would always come across the same point at the bottom. But, if there's something else that happens at the top, then indeed every 12,000 years, you would have some sort of change that occurs. How do I feel about potentially living in that? But it is what it is, isn't it? Is that maybe why more people are starting to become interested in it? More people are trying to understand where they fit in the grander scheme of things. Some people might say it's probably a good thing that it's going to happen because, we're not necessarily doing our planet any service. I don't know whether any of those are necessarily true. For me, the important thing is, continuing the journey of wanting to learn and understand more. And as you do, becoming aware of, things that might happen that you can sort of take account of. I'm not saying you should build a bunker and go and live in that bunker because, it's probably 2,000 years. I know that you are.
We say over here.
It could.
Proper prior planning prevents poor performance, and that's what we're sticking with.
Yeah, well, it is true to an extent, but if something like what ended the last ice age happened, how much can you prepare for that, and how deep do you have to go in order to get away from it? Because in some of the stuff that I was reading, he found evidence of, Neolithic sites that had tunnels that were built underneath them. And originally they just thought they were random tunnels. But, his speculation is that those tunnels would allow them to sort of find shelter when the storms would get so bad. Because remember that these storms would be highly radioactive. The X-rays and, not only that, but, the fact that if there's plasma discharge, there's probably fires going on all over the place. It was like hell on Earth, really, I would imagine. At the same time, probably incredibly beautiful in the sky. But at the other hand, you're scared for your life the whole time. And I've often wondered, when you look at ancient cultures, why on earth did they go to so much effort to build things in the side of mountains and, carve out buildings into rock? Because it's much easier to build out of brick than it is to carve something out of stone. And yet there's there's plenty of evidence to suggest that they did it and they were extremely good at it. So why was that?
Good question. Hey, if you guys want to continue the journey with Gareth and I, watch my channel regularly and come over to See the Pattern and subscribe. He's got lots of information on cosmology and other very deep topics, and he makes it digestible for the layman. And that's why we love Gareth. Do you have any parting words? And it's always a pleasure having you on the show, Gareth.
Well, I have to say, I've been working on something that I can't really release it at the moment, but hopefully it'll be out on Friday. These idea of these gravitational lensing, and you see these beautiful images of what look like these circles. And there's one particular one that they released this week where they claim that a galaxy is seen 12 times. Well, I wanted to make a video on it because, I don't necessarily believe in gravitational lensing as a thing. I don't believe that you can curve space-time. There are other ways that you can explain it. And when I started to analyze his pictures, I found something quite remarkable that really shouldn't be there. So that's all I will say for now.
Ooh, tell me when we go off air.
So yeah, ooh. So that will be out on Friday, and not only that, but because I was talking to someone else saying, I spent hours on Sunday looking at this. Part of me thought I was just going mad seeing these things.
Did you miss?
And he was like, no, that's definitely.
Did you miss the Mercury transit?
What?
Did you miss the Mercury transit?
No, I saw it today.
Okay, sweet.
No, I saw it. I watched some of it. Yeah. Very, very nice. And actually, my son came home and he said that at school they got telescopes out and were watching it, which I was amazed at. That's brilliant.
That is awesome. Check Garrett out at See the Pattern. He's on Facebook. He's on Twitter. He has a Patreon. And Friday, he's going to drop the bomb. We love you, Gareth. Be safe.
Friday.
Friday.
See ya.